All right, this is episode 240 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the DHS report that Russia hacked some voter registration sites. Going to be talking a Ted Galen Carpenter article on Macedonia and NATO expansion. And then I want to give some analysis on the situation with North Korea. Of course, this is in the news a lot lately with Trump canceling Pompeo's trip to North Korea and the so-called belligerent letter that led to that cancellation. For those of you who would like to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com is the website for the show. But all of my work, not just the podcast, but my daily news roundup, which in a lot of ways is more or less the kind of the show notes for most of these episodes. You really get all the links. Most of the important stuff that I read is linked there, and that's libertarianinstitute.org. And the podcast is on the homepage there as well, right underneath the Scott Horton Show. All right, so let's talk about this Gareth Porter article first. I read it on antiwar.com, and it will be linked in the show notes page, and of course, is on the Daily News Roundup. And in this article, Gareth Porter goes through and breaks down the claims in the Department of Homeland Security report. And I'm sure all of you will remember this because certainly the interpretation of that report, what everybody, learned, quote unquote, from that report was that Russia hacked 21 state voter registration websites. Now, it turns out that, this claim is very far from the truth, that most of these websites weren't actually hacked at all, but were just, the targets of malware or something like that. Now, a website being the target of malware or some other kind of, broadly, say computer hacking tool like phishing or whatever, else they do to get information from the websites and what, they actually try to do on the website. I think there's a difference, in a lot of ways between maybe hacking the voter registration site in order to put a bunch of fake names on a list. And then send a bunch of Russian, nationals into the United States with, fake driver's license. And since they're on these voter registration rolls, they could go out and actually sway the, election results. That's not what was going on here. Even in the cases where I think information was taken from those sites, and I think those were only 2 of the 21 cases in Arizona and Illinois, it was just copying and taking the information. And of course, this is something that not only could be done for political reasons, but could also be done just because, information is valuable and people could go out and sell this information, put it on lists and profit from it. So by the end of the article, it's very clear, as Gareth points out, that there's no evidence at all that the Russian government had anything to do with hacking these voter registration sites. In some cases, there's some evidence, although certainly not conclusive, that suggests that it's possible that whoever did either attack the site or, attempted to get information from the site was located in Russia. But, if a U.S. criminal hacker hacks a Russian computer and either steals money from them or steals information, that isn't necessarily equivalent to the American government or the CIA doing that. No, certainly, I guess you could raise the suspicion, but you do need additional evidence to actually link those hacks, to the Russian government. And in no case are they able to do this. And in most of the cases, there's not even evidence that whatsoever that the hack originated from Russian or Russian in any sort of way. The importance of this article is this is just another really hack at all of the, little stits that are tried to, they try to bunch together to, build their case of Russiagate on. And, most of the time it turns out that the claims, at least that are interpreted from, these government reports are way overblown. They equate the indictment to guilty, verdicts rendered by a jury. They conflate the fact that Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn are going down for violations of the law, but those resulting from personal choices of Flynn and Manafort and having nothing to do both with the 2016 election and nothing to do with their connection to Donald Trump or their role in the campaign. And so just because somebody who worked for Donald Trump is guilty, in no way implies that Russia has any influence over Donald Trump or the American elections. And, for those of you who want a little bit more of the technical analysis, like I said, the article is in the show notes page. Just some, things I think about, when I read this article by Gareth Porter, just because this is, again, another claim against the, or another, kind of, rung of the Russiagate ladder that has been taken out and disproven, is that there's really, no accountability on this issue. And, most of us who read the report at the time and who have been following the Russiagate all along with a critical eye have looked at this report and said, well, what the report says doesn't necessarily lead up to the conclusions that the media is drawing from it. And it turns out, as Gareth Porter goes through and actually debunks the DHS report itself, that, we're not in a good place. And, what people, especially in the mainstream media, are willing to look critically at this kind of point in the game. I also think it's interesting that the Department of Homeland Security is, putting out this report when this wouldn't necessarily be within their purview. I would think this would be, kind of an FBI thing. And so, this is probably a little bit of my libertarian leanings coming out in this statement, but, certainly government bureaucracies seem to have a desire and a drive to expand their role, to expand their budget, to, hire more people, to, assume more power. And, maybe that was part of the move going on right here by the Department of Homeland Security by basically, trying to become the branch of the executive branch, that goes out and regulates our elections. Of course, this will give them a lot of power over a system with our elections that is somewhat decentralized. And I think that does, probably provide a lot of security and makes it very difficult, to tamper with U.S. election results. The last thing I want to talk about is just how I think important it is now to realize that this, Russiagate hysteria has really created a bias, and a phobia of the Russian people, that is very unfortunate and I think very dangerous and also racist. In the simplest way to look at it, if the Republicans had lost the election and had been pointing towards, the Mexicans or the Brazilians or the Ethiopians for costing, Donald Trump the election, the Democrats would have been crying, racism all along. And, at this point, there is absolutely no evidence of it. The fact that, every time anybody that's located in Russia or is Russian does anything, it's blamed on the Russian government, and the indictment of the Russian people overall is certainly problematic. The way that the mainstream media has treated Russians, has been extremely disappointing, to the fact that, you see it reported that when Ivanka Trump rides in the elevator with, somebody who's a Russian national, that this is the main story, that the fact that, some woman working for the NRA happened to also be Russian, and this is the biggest story for weeks. And, it's surrounding that, the fact that she's Russian, not the fact that, she was breaking the law, or in most cases, they're not even that concerned, for those of the people that are actually against, kind of, the Second Amendment, that, she's pushing the Second Amendment and gun rights. That's secondary to the fact that, she's Russian. And I think this is, just dangerous moving forward, because if, government agencies prepare faulty or misleading reports in order to justify their budget, or if, politicians look to exploit tensions between the United States and Russia, or companies that could profit off of it, like weapons makers, other countries' lobbying efforts, the Atlantic Council with NATO. And we have this bias that allows us to believe obviously shaky evidence and, questionable conclusion reached in the reports. It could be a very dangerous time. All right, moving on. Ted, Galen, Carpenter on Macedonia. Well, I guess this is, kind of similar as we're talking here about NATO expansion. And one of the justifications for NATO expansion, again, is this hysteria that Russia is somehow expanding evil empire that we need to concern ourselves with, which is clearly not the case. And, maybe you could imagine that if there wasn't all of this hysteria that Russia was somehow and Vladimir Putin trying to reform the Soviet Union, then maybe we wouldn't even have this kind of strategic argument for Macedonia joining NATO. Now, in this article, Carpenter goes through and this Tucker Carlson Donald Trump interview, where Tucker Carlson asks Trump, would you send your son to go fight and die for Montenegro? And Donald Trump says no. And I think, had he ended the statement right there, excellent, perfect. And, he brings up a very valuable point that most Americans can't find Montenegro on a map. don't know the first thing about Montenegro. Are they good? Or, are they bad? Kind of that black and white thinking that most people have. Do they have American interests in mind? Do they share American values? Is their fight worth us taking up? Can they defend themselves? Americans don't know these kind of things. However, people like John McCain and Lindsey Graham went out at the time and argued that if the United States didn't allow Montenegro into NATO, then they were at risk for being overrun by an expansionist Russia. And that anybody who opposed the addition of Montenegro to NATO was a Russian puppet Vladimir Putin, like John McCain accused Rand Paul of being. Now, in reality, I think it's kind of unlikely that Montenegro ends up being the tripwire that leads war between the United States, and NATO and Russia. However, there are other issues in the world and in Europe other than the kind of East-West Russia versus the rest of Europe divide. That includes, the former Yugoslavia states. So Montenegro does have some minor border issues with Kosovo. But the rest of the statement is where Trump got problematic by saying, the people of Montenegro were very aggressive. And the fact is, if you actually look at it, Montenegro is probably not, like I said, going to be the country to draw the United States into a war with Russia, and even not less likely, but not much more likely, to lead the U.S. into a war with a country like Kosovo or Albania. However, Macedonia is actually a country that does have some pretty hostile tensions between their large Albanian population as well as with their border with Kosovo. And there's a real possibility here. I'm not saying that it's likely, but there's a real possibility and something that the United States should think about when entering into this mutual defense pact with Macedonia. The fact that Macedonia has a border dispute with two of its neighbors and has a large unhappy minority Albanian population, some of those who are looking for secession. And so by entering into this mutual defense pact, the United States could be putting itself on the hook to defend Macedonia in the case that they would go to war with Kosovo or Albania as well as any other country, depending on how geopolitics develop in the world. And so, I think this article by Ted Galen Carpenter is just really important because it really explains the situation, how NATO expansion is putting the United States possibly on the hook to go and defend one of these European countries against its neighbors. I don't think any American would like their son or daughter going to, fight and die for Montenegro, especially, in a war against countries that, as I alluded to before, probably nobody could find on a map. Montenegro, Kosovo, Albania, don't know where they are. And having your son and daughter going to fight there would be absolutely tragic. And, it's very interesting, to ask if we put this question in front of Lindsey Graham and say, Senator Graham, you're very big on saying that Macedonia has to be a part of NATO. Are you yourself willing to go fight and die for Macedonia should, let's say, Kosovo attack? I'm guessing that Lindsey Graham probably wouldn't have a good answer to that question. And, most Americans wouldn't because they don't really understand the politics of the region. They don't understand, maybe why there's a border dispute. Did one country invade the other in the past? Were there any maybe ethnic cleansing campaigns or anything that, we would easily identify as hostile and wrong and something that we should oppose on either side? Maybe we're taking the side of the aggressor. We really don't know. All right, North Korea stuff. I want to get into first and just mention that there's a website, 38north.org, that I just want to recommend for those of you who want pretty good North Korea news and analysis. I know it's very hard to get, but I feel like 38 North is a good site for kind of giving you the facts. They read the North Korean papers, which I think is important. And they're good about, not trying to conclude too much and will say, we don't know much, but this is what we know. There's an article on 38north.org that I'll link to in the show notes page, and also one by Justin Raimondo on the issue, and I'll kind of go through both here. The 38 North article kind of points out that Kim Jong Un is in a difficult position in North Korea and has 4 things he's really trying to achieve. One is trying to improve relationship with China, the United States, and South Korea. At the same time, have some internal political shifts within his cabinet, and also to make some economic advances and kind of redesign the North Korean economy. As we know, North Korea is a very isolated state, and this was, I think, in a lot of ways designed as a function of the state by Kim Jong Un's grandfather and father. However, the grandson doesn't seem to be a big believer in this economic isolation, and I think is, looking to reach out and form ties with his neighbors. Another issue for Kim Jong Un is that he has to keep the military happy. Now, one of the things that, we see in the United States all the time is that bureaucracies like to justify themselves. Look at earlier, the Department of Homeland Security. Look at, the Pentagon doesn't like to shut down bases. There's economic incentives by the U.S. weapon makers, and, there's weapon makers in North Korea. They may be state-owned, but, somebody is the head of that branch of the government, etc. And so Kim Jong Un realizes that, there's economic, political, honor, rank incentives for the military, and that if he's looking at, easing tensions with the neighbors and, maybe getting on good terms with the United States, that the military is going to see the writing on the wall, that there's going to be less of a need for the military. And also this would, kill the nuclear program. So all the nuclear scientists, et cetera, would certainly become much less important, the long-range missile designers. So, there's constituents within North Korea, people off of incentives, off of their own interests. This is pretty basic human nature, I think. And I'm sure, like in North Korea, there's people in the United States who are isolationists and hawks and, say that you can trust the Americans. And I'm sure they made some pretty good arguments too. And then, this creates a situation where, as, maybe Kim Jong Un would say, like, I want to give up all of our weapons and throw up our hands tomorrow. But obviously the military wouldn't allow that. So he does have to kind of manage that political flank. And then kind of dealing with the fact that U.S. politics are unstable. And the example of Iran is the most obvious and clear thing here, that the United States made a deal with Iran. Iran gave up and destroyed portions of their civilian nuclear energy program, only to have the Trump administration take power 2-3 years later and now reverse the deal and is placing the sanctions back on Iran. And so these are all pretty difficult things for Kim Jong Un to deal with. And I think, especially because the American media is very kind of U.S. centric in the way they look at things, and they, kind of only evaluate others' actions based on what it might have to do with the United States. But it's important to remember that all these countries have internal politics. And so even if a country is doing something that may be kind of viewed as spurring the United States, it may not be to spur the U.S. It may be to cover the politicians' right or left flank. It may be to, improve relationships within their own region, something that, China and the United States are not on the greatest of terms right now. Obviously, I think, I don't know if, trade war is necessarily the most accurate term to describe the U.S. and Chinese relationship right now, but certainly there's a lot of tariffs being applied between the two countries. There's some issues within the South China Sea. And so if North Korea is looking to, make good with the regional superpower, at times that may not mean making the choice that makes U.S. politicians most happy. The next thing the 38 North article does is goes into a recent article in the North Korean state media that basically says that, the position of the North Korean government is that they like what Donald Trump has to say. They like what Mike Pompeo has to say. However, there's a lot of people within the Trump administration and within America as a whole that are pushing back against this Korean peace initiative. And I'm sure they're aware of what happened in Iran, where Iran gave up all of these concessions early. And so I'm sure the North Korean policy right now is a concern that, what can we do to guarantee that you're going to hold up your end of the bargain, and we're not just going to give away our whole, nuclear weapons program and missile program at the start because we know that, you may not follow through. Now, the belligerent letter was something that was described as belligerent only by two members, two anonymous figures within the Trump administration. And I don't think people have an idea of where that came from other than Josh Rogan, I believe is his name, at the New York, our Washington Post reported. And so, the phrasing that it was a belligerent letter from Kim Jong Un may be overstated. And, I think we're seeing some of that, as I know in the last show I talked about how Mattis said that the United States is prepared to restart war games, with North Korea. We're now seeing Donald Trump walk that back and say that, the United States is not going to do that right now. I feel like I mostly captured the spirit of the Raimondo article with what I've said so far, as that, kind of the media reporting is the belligerent letter narrative, and the reality is probably more of North Korea is trying to carefully navigate a lot of moving pieces within North Korea internally, with their regional neighbors of China and South Korea, looking to improve relations there, and at the same time trying to understand what's going on in U.S. politics and make a good long-term move for North Korea. All right, a few other stories I want to touch on before I wrap up. The Trump administration has cut $2 million in aid to Palestine. So, you guys know I'm a libertarian, and that as a libertarian, I'm opposed to government spending, redistribution of wealth, taxation, and all the other terrible things that come along with foreign aid. However, if you're going to start taking chunks out of the U.S. budget, the aid to Palestine should be one of the last things to go. This foreign aid, I think, is a little bit different. It's not like a country with terrible politics, say like a Venezuela situation. Let's say there's no U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, but it's in a terrible situation, and the U.S. government elects not to provide U.S. taxpayer money to that country. I think that is the correct decision. Not that you can't and shouldn't provide personal, donations to the country if, people are poor unnecessarily. However, Palestine, I think, is a little bit different of a situation, because the people there are cut off. They're denied the rights, to fish in open seas for bigger fish. They're denied the right to leave. They can't, I'm looking at the people of Gaza specifically, they barely have enough to import. They only have power a couple hours a day. The people in the West Bank and East Jerusalem don't fare much better. And then there's, millions of Palestinian refugees around the world. A lot of these people in situations, because of the United States and Israeli government, they're outside their control, and there's nothing they could do. Their resistance is labeled as terrorism, and if they break the laws, they're killed and no one cares. So, this is a little bit different. This is, I think, more holding somebody hostage and providing them with food, versus, forced redistribution of wealth. The Trump administration had a plan to cut $3.5 billion in foreign aid, and I believe this plan to cut the $3.5 billion in foreign aid didn't actually include the $200 million cut to aid to Palestine and the $300 million cut to aid to Syria. So had this gone through, it would have been about $400 billion in U.S. aid that the Trump administration didn't give out this year. However, they reversed the plan after mostly Senate pushback against it. All right, some stories on Africa that I've meant to get to over the past week or so and haven't had a chance. There's been some fighting in Tripoli. I think some of this has had to do with militants potentially linked to ISIS. At least 5 people died in one of the clashes. There's ISIS across the border in Chad right now in Libya, and some of those guys ran off a group of Chadian soldiers near the Libyan border. In Niger, the United States is building a drone base. That drone base is going to cost $110 million to complete and another $30 million to operate annually. And then, getting a lot less attention than the Ebola outbreak last time around, there's another Ebola outbreak in Africa, this time located in the Congo. This one, as I mentioned the first time I talked about this on the show, is particularly dangerous because it's in an area with a lot of militants and fighting. And so aid workers are having a lot of concern right now that the situation created around war, the taking of hostages and prisoners, the fact that, it's harder to treat people may be forced into small rooms, general chaos would, cause the Ebola outbreak to spread pretty rampantly. And, this could be really, really problematic and dangerous. So I think it's probably a good idea to keep your eyes on what's going on in the Congo right now and hope that the, doctors group and aid workers that are there can squash this outbreak before it gets too bad. All right, that's where I wrap up the show. Thanks everybody for tuning in this week. I really appreciate that listeners keep coming back to the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com to share the show. libertarianinstitute.org. You can find my news roundup and the podcast there. I run a news website, immersionnews.com. It's got all the links you need to keep up with the foreign policy news. If you really like the show and the work I do and want to donate to the show, I would really appreciate patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Twitter is at KYAAALE, and Facebook is Libertarian Union.